For Tolkien Reading Day, an upcoming film titled The Lord of the Rings: Shadow of the Past just got announced by Peter Jackson and Stephen Colbert, who's a huge Tolkien fan. It's tough to read the room on how excited or not people feel about Shadow of the Past. I do feel people are mostly dismissive of The Hunt for Gollum, which will come out first, but I gotta say, I feel conflicted about Shadow of the Past. I'm kind of on the fence with it. I feel like there's this problem with the future films, which, funny enough, does not exist with the separate Rings of Power TV series. There are ideas I like about Shadow of the Past, but with what's looming over it, is the title perhaps too fitting? Hi everyone, this is Steven Schinder Reviews in video form. It's been a while, but I finally got a topic that really made me want to put a video together really quick for the channel. I love The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, watched the animated stuff really young, saw the live-action trilogy in theaters in the early 2000s, and it was an annual tradition for me for 9 consecutive years to read those books. Even managed to eventually crack the Silmarillion and read other stuff here and there, though I wouldn't say I have the encyclopedic knowledge that other Tolkien fans might have, just letting you all know where I'm coming from. Shadow of the Past is the title of Chapter 2 of Fellowship of the Ring, in which Gandalf gives Frodo all the backstory about the One Ring, but in the video announcement, Colbert mentioned wanting to adapt chapters 3 through 8 of the Fellowship of the Ring, from 3 as company to Fog on the Barrow Downs. If you've read these chapters, you know these cover the Hobbit's journey out of the Shire. It includes stuff I actually really like, those being Tom Bombadil and the Barrow-wights. Now, some of you may have already seen Tom Bombadil in Rings of Power, but I feel he wasn't whimsical enough in that show. So there's enough room to create a Tom Bombadil here who's in more of his sing-songy glory, though I'm not sure if that's the route that this would go. And the Barrow-wights are these other wraith-like beings, so I can see how maybe they would have seemed redundant for the Fellowship of the Ring film that got made back in the day. But the encounter there leads to the hobbits gaining some ancient swords. So Colbert wants these chapters adapted in such a way where they can also fit into the Peter Jackson film, making this somewhat of an intraquel, since some of it takes place within a gap of the already on-screen story. Saying all that, I do get kind of excited. There are certainly things from the books I wish could have made it on screen that didn't. Not too long ago, the War of the Rohirrim animated film, and the willingness to continue exploring Middle-earth via animation, kind of gave me this idea that maybe in the future they could release an animated film based on the Scouring of the Shire. This chapter, late in The Return of the King, is essentially the hobbits returning to the Shire, and having to deal with Saruman. This was not included in the live-action film, which makes it seem like all is peaceful upon their return. It would certainly not fit with the continuity of the extended editions, given Saruman's fate there. But why not make something like that, which would at least fit with the continuity of the theatrical films? Now, Shadow of the Past, I'm pretty certain is going to be live action, and I would like to see more animation. I kind of feel like people don't give animation as much of its due as they should in some regards, in some areas, but anyway, we got this logline for Shadow of the Past. I got this from the Variety article. Quote, 14 years after the passing of Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin set out to retrace the first steps of their adventure. Meanwhile, Sam's daughter, Eleanor, has discovered a long-buried secret and is determined to uncover why the War of the Ring was very nearly lost before it even began. Unquote. While I do not think it has been confirmed, I feel pretty certain we're going to get returning actors for this wraparound thing. Sean Astin, Dominic Monaghan, Billy Boyd. It sounds like this would be 14 years after Frodo sails away, so they'd be older, meaning, thankfully, no weird de-aging effects, I would hope. Though I wouldn't put it past them to use that sort of thing for when the story goes back in time to the era of Fellowship, and a story that takes place after the ones we've seen would in a way be kind of more interesting if they could find something to tell, but I really feel like they're going to rely on the past here, so that does give me a bit of pause, I admit. I know Orlando Bloom had that statement about how they could use AI to de-age him if they were to put Legolas in The Hunt for Gollum, and people were concerned over Aragorn, though there's speculation that he might be recast, which would be the best thing to do, in my opinion, if they do have to make that film at all, The Hunt for Gollum. But for Shadow of the Past, I guess we'd have to see if they're willing to recast for the flashbacks, or if they would do some weird de-aging. I don't know how convincing that would look, because even as advanced as things get, there's still this thing in my mind where I look at the face and I think to myself, I know that that's not how they actually look, that's their actual face. I'm not sure really how to verbalize it. It's just when I see it, it's not convincing enough to me. I'm not sure if it will ever be convincing enough to me. It's really tough to say. But anyway, this leads me to my reservations when it comes to either of these projects, other than the stuff I've mentioned just now. Both The Hunt for Gollum and Shadow of the Past kind of reek of, let's find ways to bring back these actors to remind you of those movies you loved from 25 years ago. The Hobbit trilogy kind of did something like that too, with the wraparounds including Elijah Wood and Ian Holm, which was fine, but then they kept pushing to remind you of Legolas, much to the detriment of that character and how he was presented there. And even shoehorned in these in-your-face references to Gimli and Aragorn. I didn't mind so much showing the encounter with Sauron and what Gandalf was up to during the events of The Hobbit, but there were certainly elements that could have been dialed back to do justice to the Hobbit story. The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, while I did like that animated film, had a little bit of this issue too, where in the middle of the conflict that stands alone for that film and is set in a different time period, there's this encounter with orcs who are searching for the One Ring. It's like they included this bit as a way to justify using the Lord of the Rings in the title. They got Eowyn actress Miranda Otto to narrate for that film, which felt like a nice touch, but now kind of feels like it continues this trend where the newer films, in a way, feel like they're prioritizing finding ways to bring back the actors we already know and tell stories that have to connect to them. Because then there's that nostalgia factor for the audiences. It's also worth noting that The War of the Rohirrim was made to maintain the film rights. They basically put out something they can make quicker just to stall for these other films. So that behind the scenes little tidbit, it feels weird. It just makes the whole thing feel weird in a way. Even if it's due to separate teams and separate rights situations, the Rings of Power TV show doesn't have these issues, really. You have Galadriel and Elrond, familiar characters, but played by different actors. They're characters you might recognize, but it's not bringing back legacy actors to try and tell you to be invested in the new story. It's able to be more of its own thing. And yes, I know it's not a super accurate adaptation of Tolkien's works, but I still feel it carries the spirit of those works for the most part. And without the legacy actor problem messing with my own personal immersion, I honestly feel more excited for more Rings of Power than for either of these future films, which themselves feel like they're just trying to hold your hand and assure you that the 2000s films you remember are still alive. But we shouldn't need that hand-holding. Just tell interesting stories, and trust the audience to engage with them. New stories can be interesting when they feel like their own thing in different eras. Otherwise, if we keep the hand-holding and keep going back to the well, it really does feel like we are living in the shadow of the past. Look, I'm not saying Shadow of the Past is the worst idea ever. Like I said earlier, there are elements of it I wanted to see on screen, and for all I know, it could end up being better than what I think. But I do wonder if all this wishing for all that comes with a be careful what you wish for type of deal. And I know a lot of audiences prefer to trust what they're familiar with, hence the framing devices and returning legacy actors. Familiarity makes a lot of money, but at some point, somehow, audiences should be invited to engage with something that doesn't guarantee as much familiarity. There might be the fear that they would get too confused, but for all we know, it could turn out just fine. If audiences get used to having to figure out some of the context on their own, without a cheat sheet of legacy actors, then maybe the storytelling will feel more authentic and all the more rewarding. Anyway, that's all I have for this video. What do you think? Are you excited for Shadow of the Past or even The Hunt for Gollum? Looking forward to more Rings of Power? What other stories would you like to see adapted from Tolkien's Legendarium? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching Steven Shinder Reviews in video form, and I'll see you all next time.